It's great to have you with us on Curiosity, Not Judgment. Welcome back. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So we're talking today about a phrase that I learned a few years back in the nonprofit space, and the phrase is not for us, without us. And it's that idea that you are going to include the people at the table for whom you're trying to derive a plan or a process or a procedure, that you're not thinking you know best without including them as stakeholders in the situation. And so I thought we could talk through that and ask some very curious questions along the way.
That's interesting. What strikes me when you say that is, one of the things I used to hear my mother say, common sense isn't. When you say don't design something for a group or even an individual without including them in the solution, it just makes common sense.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I can count on both hands times when I can think of that just happening today,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where our government or very well-meaning people
Mm-hmm.
will enact regulations, laws, practices, things that are going on that do not include in any real way the very people that are that will be subject to it.
Yeah.
I think we fought a revolution about that.
I think you're right. You know, you're correct in the statement that you probably have, 10 or more examples that have just happened today, because it's very commonplace. And it is, assuming the best, it is very innocent in nature that you have really smart people trying to solve really complex problems, and they're putting their best efforts out there. They're doing their best design work, their best modeling, all of these things. And yet, if they haven't taken the step of including the people that are going to be most impacted by this in the whole process, they're missing the mark.
And isn't this a little bit also about taking a systems approach, including all the parts of the system, including those which will be most affected by it?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so I don't know how we begin to really have this be kind of at the forefront of our thinking, but I think we all do it. It's just a natural, like, ooh, I've got a good idea and I want to act on it. And maybe that idea is to design something, and you're designing something for a specific portion of the population. And maybe you are part of that population, but if you haven't sampled others, you don't really know the opinions or the needs of the other voices in the room.
Now, Steve Jobs famously said that, when someone said, well, isn't the customer always right? And he said something about, well, the customer doesn't know what they want. When he came, I think this was in relation with coming up with the iPod, the old 1,000 songs in your pocket thing, which turned out to be wildly successful. I think that's a case, it's interesting because I think that's a case of the customer may not know what they want because they don't know what's possible. And I think sometimes we, with good intentions, come up with ideas or visions because we're trying to speak something into existence or make something possible that the very people who will be subject to it don't know is possible, right? We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's a good point, and I want to come back to that. I can think of an example, though, that happened within, the last month to us. We're going through the process of trying to design something, and we went to a designer and laid out what we wanted, and we were told point blank, no, that's not what you want. You don't know what you want because you've never had any better. And so it's kind of in that same field, but not. And so to me, I was outraged. Like, how dare you, person that I'm going to pay money to design this thing for me? How are you going to say to me, no, that's not what you want, when we've thought through it very carefully? And sure, maybe something that he's designed in the past maybe has a something better to offer than what we've imagined, but just the audacity of that statement made me want to walk away and not do business.
Right, exactly. And he probably could have worded that better. Something like, did you go to the Parade of Homes last year? Are you aware of the different ways you can design homes now? Have you ever seen, dual dishwashers or marble countertops or some of these things that you might see in a forward-looking thing like a Parade of Homes? Or have you gone to a new home show recently, or a remodeling show or something, just to see what's possible, instead of you don't even know what you want?
Yeah. So then I do think back to the Steve Jobs statement, and he was so innovative and so future thinking. He was imagining something that very few people would have the capacity to imagine. So in that case, the statement of the customer doesn't know what they want because this thing hasn't ever been on the market before, that is a curious thing for me to think through now, because while it has some similarities to the appalling statement that I received, it is in a different field in that it's a technology that has not yet ever come to market.
Right. So technology is one thing, and we know that that's ever evolving. And AI, I think, would if there was an AI bot sitting here right now, it would say to us, "You don't know what you want because you don't have the expansive neuron system that can come up with something that is much better than you're thinking." And I think that's part of the reason that some of us are concerned about AI is that it will think it knows better than we do what we want.
Well, I remember, I don't know how long ago it's been, but we were talking about what happens when the system, whatever that is, a technology run system, begins to make decisions for you based on health patterns and things that it knows about you, right? So if you have all of these interlinked systems and you go to a box store and you buy a big container of cookies and the transaction is declined because it's linked to your health information that says you're already pre-diabetic, is that the system and is that the world in which we want to live?
I don't want my Dion's app,
which is a pizza place,
linked. Sorry, in Albuquerque, Dion's is the famous pizza place locally. I don't want my Dion's app talking to my healthcare app, right?
Right, for sure not.
Because then the next time I go to my Dion's app, it'll say, "Are you sure this is your second pizza this week?"
Yeah.
And I think you've had enough.
Yeah, I don't know that they would ever say that, but maybe you've got an intermediary where that's a new job now, is for them to run interference between you and your pizza.
Right.
Yeah, it is. These are curious questions, right? So you do have to design technology included with the end user in mind. I think that we have had many experiences over the years of trying to work a program, an app, a something that is not intuitive, that does not cater to the needs of the regular people. And so again, if you're the smartest person in the room and you know all the stuff and you design something based on your IQ and everyone's 20 points behind you, well, you've got to add them to the equation when you're designing something.
Yeah, and you just said something that's very important, and that is that we're all different, and it's not better or worse, it's just different. And so if you and your echo chamber design something for, and you're trying to scale it, then maybe that's not so good. I remember in the old Myers-Briggs type indicator days, we did a Myers-Briggs test, and we found out that all of us at Intel that were making decisions in the room one day were all ESTJs. And so we intentionally got some INFPs involved and said, "Hey, what do you guys think about this?" And we were horrified because they didn't like any of it, right? And I was like, okay, there's people out there that think differently than me. It's something that we know is true, but we don't consider it.
Yeah.
At least as often as we should. At least for me, I should say. I don't consider it. I know it's true. I know people think differently than me, thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd all be pretty boring. But I don't consider it sometimes when I think I'm having a good idea.
I can think of so many applications where some good curious questions about the end user would be really beneficial. Everything from writing books to designing gadgets to building technology platforms to building a widget that's going to end up on the moon, right? So I mean, ultimately you have to consider who is the consumer, who rather is the person that is going to be the beneficiary of this thing, and if you're not willing to consider who they are, then I think that there are some curious questions you need to pause and begin to ask yourself. I remember some counsel, and I'm trying to remember if you and I have had this conversation or not. I don't think so, but about personas. That when you are writing something or when you are doing social media, this particular lesson was around social media, was you have to have a persona in mind in order to have an effective campaign. So let's say, for example, it's a Facebook or an Instagram campaign, and I'm really trying to direct people to buy this blanket, right? So when the ad campaign gets designed, they always tell you, who is the person on the other end of that campaign? And it's not everybody. That is not the right answer. So is it a man or a woman? Is it, somebody under 12? Is it somebody, between 14 and 18? Whatever. Pick the demographic. And they keep getting more and more and more nuanced until finally you say, this is for single moms who are working 2 jobs and earn less than $30,000 a year. I'm just making stuff up, right? Because when you have that nuanced of an understanding about who your audience is, then all of a sudden your design is completely different, and you are trying to cater to the person who would ultimately be the consumer or the recipient.
We had this experience when I took my foray into home healthcare. When I started up a home care company because of a situation with my mom, I, as an engineer, I just figured I'm going to be selling, home care to elderly folks who want to stay in their home. It's not the case at all. When we studied, it turns out that there's a client and a decision maker. And the decision maker is often, most of the time in this case, not the client. The decision maker turns out to be a female who is between the ages of 42 and 58, who is making the decision for parents or parents-in-law about keeping them in their home versus putting them in an assisted living or nursing home. And so because we knew that demographic, it made all the difference in the world. And we called it face of the customer. So same thing, persona, face of the customer. It's totally effective. Now, once you find that out, it makes it better to target that audience and then get feedback from that audience as to what works and doesn't work for them, which is your whole point about
not for us
without us.
Yeah.
But what if you know what's best for those other people?
But do you?
I know what's best for you, so I'm going to do this. Well, I'll give you an example. I sometimes, just for fun, tell my grandkids, hey, there's going to be a time in your lifetime when you're not going to be allowed to drive a car. What? What are you talking about? And I say, well, because when we get to autonomous vehicles and the accident rate drops by 90%, just like seatbelts and many other things, it's going to become the law. And just get ready for it. And they're just like, no way, that'll never happen. You're never going to take away our right to drive. Americans will never put up with it. I'm not so sure, right? So I think sometimes we do it for the good of society or for the good of a group of people, even if the people don't like it.
Ooh, that's a hornet's nest right there. So I can tell you another example about legislation. So, similar vein, but we have some really, really antiquated legislation in the state of New Mexico. And when some of this verbiage was crafted, specific to the topic of human trafficking and penalties, it was in the same kind of arena as trafficking animals, smuggling. And so the statutes and the mandates that we have on the books right now are terrible. So you can get a higher prison sentence if you're caught selling cocaine than if you're caught selling a person, right? So in the moment, maybe a well-meaning legislator or group of legislature, let me try that again. Those guys and gals, well-meaning, crafted some, verbiage around that. And then 15, 20, 50 years later, not only is it not working, but it's, we look at that and think, how could anyone ever think that, that was okay? There was never a vision that human trafficking was going to become a thing, right?
Yeah, so now we got to give some grace for context, right? And so in the context that they first came up with these laws, they did not have an awareness of something that was either happening and they weren't aware of it at the time, and or new data comes in. And I think that I've been playing a lot with this in my brain, and the real purpose of Curiosity Not Judgment is to continuously improve your mental models of what's going on around you in the world. Because once you make a judgment, the thinking stops and you allow yourself to just remain stagnant. And so, I think that's the point. What we need to do now is go back to those same laws and say, okay, now we're aware of this. And so we need to enhance this part of it, change this, make new. You don't necessarily have to ditch the whole thing and start over, but you need to make some enhancements and some tweaks based on new data, and not just say, well, that's the law, and so that's where we are and we're stuck with it. We're not stuck with it just because it's a current law or regulation. If we're smart about it and we're continuously improving our models, then we have the ability to change that and make it better, given our new context.
Right. But going to your autonomous vehicle question, at what point does the system, I don't even know what to call it, know better than we do, right? So if the prevailing theory is going to be autonomous vehicles will cut down traffic accidents by 90%, we don't know what we don't know yet, right? Because we haven't gotten there. And inevitably, something is going to come forward if and when that becomes an enacted law or an enacted regulation. And so, are we giving up our right to be involved in decision making when data or computer programming or processes tell us this is going to be the way that it is?
So that's and that you bring up a great point, because we sometimes make decisions based on inadequate data, and we just think, well, this sounds good, so let's just do it. And we may or may not have conclusive data that this is going to improve the system. Do you know the origin of the brake light in the top of your back windscreen?
I do not.
So, and I'm going to get this wrong, so give me a little bit of grace here. But Ralph Nader, who was a big consumer advocate back in the 70s and 80s, ran for president a couple of times. He did some study, or came up with the idea about the fact that you're looking here and you're not always looking here. And so brake lights you may not see. It would be safer if they also had one in the back upper part of a back windshield. And so he went to Congress, and Congress enacted this law that all vehicles now have this thing. Now, was there perfect data when we made that decision? I doubt it,
Right.
But it was made for the good of the people, right? Some people would argue that seatbelts can sometimes do more harm than good, and yet we all use them and we all buckle up, and there's a big alarm in our car that will not leave us alone until we do. And so there are some things that we do because we think that doing the thing is better than not doing the thing, and we'll make laws about it. Now, we could update it. Now we have airbags.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've added to, well, if you've got airbags in the car, do you still need a seatbelt? I think so. But, so I think that's the key, is if we're continuously improving our models and we can say that with some level or enough level of certainty that this is a good thing, well then, we're going to go ahead and do it. Is it a good thing?
Right. Well, so going back to the question about, are we having that idea of not for us, without us in mind when we design? I would think, by and large, that yes, people are included in the design of vehicle and around safety, because it is because of the loss of life or serious injury that many of these changes and inventions were started in the first place, right? I mean, obviously there was enough data around people getting in rear end collisions that Nader said, okay, well, our gaze is low, we need to bring up the gaze so that we notice the brake light. Same thing with seatbelts and airbags. It was because X number of people were killed flying through a front windshield and all of these things. And so I think in that case, at least, the people are included, that they are included in the design process.
Yes, but back to autonomous driving, which is an extension of this. Are we going to take away people's rights to drive vehicles? Because if all the vehicles out there are autonomous, then they're going to look out for each other. Now, ironically, that was set back by decades because of a person who got hit by an autonomous vehicle in Phoenix, Arizona, And, and so people pointed to that and said, well, what about that? And then people don't like machines making decisions. They will say, well, what about if the car is driving down the road and they have the choice of hitting a grandmother or a kid? How are you going to program that machine? Because we ultimately program the machines, or are they going to become smart enough to make that decision on their own? And how do they make that decision? And so we can stifle ourselves in our progress and hypotheticals also. So anyway, as part of societal progress, involving the people who are going to be subject to something is absolutely a big part of it. And do we have that representation in the room? And then do we also have put some credence to societal benefit into the decision making?
No, I think those are really good, curious questions. But I think we really need to start with ourselves, right? If we are creating something, whatever that something is, are we taking the time to include others' voices in the process so that if the end goal is to sell something, to design something, to whatever, craft something, do we have them in mind when we're doing this thing? And I think we really have to begin with that process, or that question rather, because there are so many brilliant ideas out there. There's no question about it. So many people have these amazing, amazing ideas that could shape and change the world. But just have you taken the time to include the voices in the room, to bring the people to the table for whom the solution or product is being designed?
So recently, just last week, I was in a situation where I was listening to someone talk about this very thing. And so we believe that, given a certain set of assumptions, that our power grid is full of clean energy and that electricity is the way to convey that, the best way into homes, and that heat pumps are much more efficient than boiler systems or Freon-based air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. So we should put heat pumps everywhere. And so this very well-meaning person is standing on stage talking about how she went to Houston to implement heat pumps into this poor neighborhood. And she was working with some community-based organizations, presumably to do exactly what you're saying, to involve those folks. And the feedback that she got was, well, wait a minute, these homes have holes in the roof and no insulation, single pane windows. You're going to put a heat pump in there? That's a little bit of cart before the horse. There needs to be other things addressed before that makes sense in this situation. And the person was a bit stymied. It's like, well, wait a minute, I'm coming here trying to do the right thing for this community. And the feedback I'm getting is it's not the right thing. So what do you do then?
Ooh, that we might have to leave this episode on a cliffhanger. I think that is the very next best question to ask to stay in that curiosity mindset is, if you discover, due to the voices of others, that the thing that you thought was so brilliant isn't as brilliant as you once thought, are you willing to change?
Right. And do you change the approach? Do you change the actual thing? Do you pivot like a good entrepreneur and say, okay, maybe I ought to think about, weatherization and other things first and then do that? Or could this thing that I want have a several step process before I get to that? And then how do I implement this? And is it, one person at a time and I'm okay, starfish, I help that person? Or do I need it to scale and everybody get it?
Yeah. I would love some audience feedback, especially those of you that are history buffs or maybe are based kind of in the technology world. Are there things that came to market that clearly did not involve the end user in their creation that maybe could have been amazing had they taken that step? I would love to hear some answers if any of you have come across those types of stories. Great things just to ponder. If only they would have asked me, this thing would have been gold. Right? So let us know if you've got some of those. Great always to hear from you guys. So curiositynotjudgment.com is our website. We've got a comment section right there on the website. And for those of you that have maybe joined us newly, yes, I spelled judgment the British way when I did the URL. So it's JUDGEMENT, curiositynotjudgment.com. And yeah, no judging on that one.
Yeah. Don't judge, just be curious about, are there multiple ways to spell judgment?
Yeah, go back to episode 1. You'll hear the story. All right, thanks for listening. We appreciate your time. And of course, we love your feedback, so please drop us a line. And you can also drop some comments on the YouTube channel as well. So stay curious, and we'll catch up with you next week.
Take care.